So we got 5 basic topics, 5 sections to cover today. In the big picture, we're going to talk about, creating and automating a budget and addressing those budget gaps. We're also going to look pretty deeply at some of those really big expense decisions that we have, housing and automotive expenses. And to kick us off, Paul's going to start.
So the first topic we're going to cover is creating your budget and automation. So let's get right into it. So before I get into like what goes into a budget, I'm curious if anybody's ever created a budget, or I guess a better term is spending plan, because sometimes budget has a negative connotation. So, and I'll say that I myself do it. My partner, there we go, got some responses. My partner doesn't care to, so I think with me, that's why she doesn't have to do it. And if you don't, that's fine too. I think it's most people don't, so there's no shame or problem with that. Sometimes, okay. So if you have done it, you might have some experience with this and be familiar with some of the things we're going to go through. What this entails is determining your take-home pay or how much you're going to make after taxes from your paycheck, and then how much you're saving. Those are the first parts of determining your budget. And once you know the inflows portion, you then want to look at expenses such as your fixed expenses and your variable expenses. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So once you know your income and expenses, then you want to, if at all possible, you want to automate these processes in terms of getting the money to your accounts, getting the payment set up so that you don't have to worry about it. And it's just, everything's just kind of automated and you don't have to, worry about it. So going a little bit deeper into the budget components, you see you have income, which is anything that you're paid that you receive after taxes. So this can be from an employer or doing side gigs if you're self-employed, or money you receive from family, any sort of form of income that you're getting after taxes. With savings, you can see here, you want to start at least with about 10% that you're putting aside. And if you can save more, then that would be even better. But 10% is a starting point. And then you have your fixed expenses, which I mentioned earlier. So these are bills that stay the same every month. So this might be your rent or a car payment. And then after that, you have variable expenses. And these are the ones that vary month to month. So this might be utilities or discretionary expenses like coffee purchases, because every month these might be different. And that's why they're called variable. And then lastly, anything left over can go towards, your wants, meaning you can buy more coffee, you can donate money to like a certain charity, or you can just save more towards whatever goals you have, whether it's short-term, long-term, or retirement.
So Paul actually introduced these steps just moments ago, but I wanted to go make a finer point on 2 items. And really it's step 2 here. So obviously it comes before step 3 and step 4. And that's really the key here. It's plan your savings first. A lot of folks we have, there's kind of 2 ways people do this in terms of building their savings. The first way is, they spend on this and they spend on that. They do all their spending at the end of the month. If something's left over, that goes into their savings. And that is not a way to get to any kind of goals you have set up. The best thing you can do is take off that percentage and I, it's the same presentation, but Paul and I agree on this generally outside the presentation. That starts with about 10%. You start with 10% of your income and put that towards long-term savings first, and then specific goals. If you go more than 10%, that's great. And then you do those fixed expenses and then do your variable expenses on top of that. And then the second thing I want to actually focus a little bit more specifically on is calculating your variable expenses. Now, I don't know if any of you have done this. If you have an idea of what it means, I want to pop this into the chat. Have you ever calculated your variable expenses?
And Jonathan, you're saying like overall, like all variable expenses, or you mean like specific ones, or?
So it's interesting because they change. I asked that because variable expenses, they're variable. So as I, just before summertime, I noticed that my variable expenses increase for 2 reasons, right? One, it's usually time for us to think about vacation. 2, I've got 2 kids, so it's like summer camp time. So I noticed that when I'm going into April, May, June, I see my variable expenses increase relative to December, January, February. So it's just usually it's not enough to do this in 1 month because they shift so much throughout the year. You have to do it a number of times, and then you have to average that to get a real good sense of what your real long-term variable expenses are. So we move on. So then the thing is we have to think about this. How do we automate this? Like, what is the simple process? It's a medium soft hard cap. Excellent. what is the process of automating these things, right? This can be, you can almost do complete automation with a lot of your bills, a lot of your finances, from savings to bills to everything. So occasionally, so my kids both take care of the local, we have a, not that anyone can use it now, but we have a pool in our neighborhood, and they sweep up the pool and take the garbage out, and they, right? So they get checks in the mail, which is very interesting, because we don't go to the bank anymore. So we have to have some sort of, I know there's online deposit. That wasn't always the case 3 years ago. So it's very, no one I know, not many people receive checks anymore. From clients, that's a little different. You're freelancing, that's a little different. But the easiest part of automating this process, to have a direct deposit of your check. And then you can actually set up, whether it's directly from your bank or with a credit card to get points or miles, you can set up auto pay on most of your bills. And if you're not comfortable with doing auto pay, like connecting things directly to your bank account, which I am not, I do not personally like connecting, giving somebody, East Bay Mud, PG&E, the ability to debit my account. Because what if I have an argument with them about what the bill should be, right? So I'm not comfortable with it. So what I do is I set it up for bill pay, and it's automated because I get an electronic bill, I get notified electronic bill, I pay the bill automatically with like 2 clicks through my bank system. So banks often have these systems to use as well. So not only that, you can actually set up automatic transfers into savings, and whether you have accounts at Vanguard or with a manager like us, you can set up automatic ACH deposits into an investment account, and that can be automatically invested. So much of this entire process, if you do it right, can be very easily automated. And when it's automated, it's kind of, you don't have to think about it anymore, right? The thing you have to watch is make sure that the money that's going to be taken out is there. You have to manage an amount in the account that is always going to be there no matter what. So then when you do it this way, you actually have a way to monitor things as well. So your cash in the account, your spending account, should actually increase a little bit every month. So after 3 months, you have a little bit of excess that money can then be, you can make a decision. Do I save that money? Do I invest that money? Do I go out to dinner with that money? Because I already have my long-term savings figured out. So it's a way to automate, and then it's a check on your system, which is something that's I think makes a lot of sense.
And Jonathan, I just want to say real quick. So someone said they sometimes get checks, and then someone else did say they receive a paper check. And I just want to make a quick comment that, now we can, if you are getting checks from clients, you can also get paid through PayPal or Venmo and those kind of things now. And that makes it a little bit easier. Or if you do get a check, now you can just do it with your phone, right? You can deposit it at home. Yeah. So there's some nice features about that.
Yeah. Your bank, most banks, in ways to track these things, most banks offer some kind of tracking and integration with other accounts. And just a quick question, what is the number one third-party tracking software that everyone uses? So many people use. If you use one, pop it in there. That's a business. Yeah, that's a business one. What's the name of yeah, there we go. Mint. That's the one that I always hear about a lot. And that one's really known because it is an Intuit. Before it was Intuit, it was actually well known then. Just a few things. Obviously, it's got to be easy to use, and you want it to be secure, but less obviously, and this is really important because there's literally a new app that does this about every moment. Fintech is one of the most, financial technology is one of the most heavily funded things in the venture capital space. And so less obviously, free doesn't mean no cost. Free means no financial cost. If there's one thing we've learned about free in the last probably 3-4 years, we've learned from Facebook. Free has other costs. Technology that gives us access to things for free, they're getting money from us or from something that, our data or something. So be aware of anyone that shares data, be aware of the advertising exposure you're subjecting yourself to, be aware of all of these things before you sign up for a free tracking software like this. Mint is actually a pretty good one because they're still collecting data, almost guaranteed. But it's run by Intuit, which is someone that's been out there and we kind of trust them. It's not somebody we don't know.
Yeah, and then I also want to say my experience with Mint is the nice thing is no one can get to your accounts, so they can't pull any money, they can't do anything, they can only see your accounts if they were to hack in.
Right.
So, yeah, the next section we're going to address is once you have your budget set up, we want to analyze it and address any gaps there may be. So we're going to get into the exciting part in a moment here. So we're going to look at some different ratios or calculations in order to determine how you're doing with your budget. And these include ratios that have to do with housing, debt, and savings, and your savings rate. So I asked earlier if you set up a budget before. So if you did say yes, I'm curious if you update it or review it regularly. And if you do so, how often? And if you don't, maybe how often would you do it? How about that? Quarterly, okay.
Quarterly. Once a year. Yeah.
So once there's a budget set up, you want to make sure to review it regularly. This could be quarterly, it could be once a month. You know, I personally, since I'm in the business, I do it once a week, but I'm a little over the top with that. But the reason you want to do this is because your budget may change over time. You know, your estimates may be wrong, so you want to verify these things. And you also then want to identify when you may be overspending according to your values. So I know someone mentioned, Kuala, I think it was you, about the hard cap with your, and you just keep raising it. So you want to make adjustments as time goes on. And then lastly, you determine how much you want to allocate for the future or savings. Because bottom line is you want to know how much money's coming in and then how much is going out. And then where's it going to, right? Because you want to know which expenses, which accounts is your inflows accumulating in, and then also where your savings are going to.
So we have we're going to talk about a few ratios here that sort of give you a sense of where you are in the big picture relative to all those little minute details of budgeting. This gives you a sense of how you're doing in the big picture. And so what we have here on the right side is we have a calculation for a spending rate. We have at the bottom, we have, what did I call this? A continuum of
concern.
Yeah, continuum of concern. And then on the left lower, we sort of, how do we translate this into a savings rate? So a spending rate, very simply, is your total monthly spending divided by your total monthly income. In this case, it's $3,500 divided by $4,000, right? So that's 0.88. What that means is you spend 88% of your income. On that continuum of concern, just ignore the little bubble. If you look way over to the left, if you're spending 1.1, that's 110% of your income, that's a critical problem. If you're spending, 100% of your income, that's actually a problem. That's a priority. We got to figure that out. If you're spending 90% of your income, it's important to make sure you're in control there. But in this case, it's 88%. That's pretty much right on plan for many people. So it's a pretty good place. Now, how do we get to the savings rate when you have the spending rate? The savings rate is just 1 minus your spending rate. So in this case, it's 12%. So you're saving 12% of your income. So in this, we have the debt service ratio. Now, this is often used by lenders to determine credit worthiness. It's the percentage of your income that goes to making debt payments. So a high number here signifies low disposable income, and it signifies an individual or a family that's a little bit at risk. And there's really two aspects of this. It's the total debt ratio, and then I think Paul's going to introduce us to a housing expense ratio that's more specific to housing.
Yes, this is good. I mean, it's mainly used when it comes to getting pre-approved for mortgages, and I'll get into that in a moment. But just initially, in terms of how much you want to be spending for housing expenses is based off of this ratio. So you take your monthly housing expenses, you can see there at the top right, and divide it by your monthly gross income. And so in this example, you can see that this person spends $1,200 per month on their housing expenses. And then their income's $4,000 after taxes. So their housing expense ratio is 0.3. So if you look at the scale of concern, this is towards the higher end. I mean, you typically don't want to go above 0.31 in terms of, to be honest, 0.28 is actually a really conservative place you want to be, but 0.31 is where you're starting to get to the high end. And I think you can get approved for a mortgage even as high as 0.35. And that's usually not a great place to be. And I think during the housing crisis, they're going even higher, which is a big problem. But as you can see in this example, the ratio is at 0.3, which is, it's getting closer to the higher end of concern. So if you were to want to adjust this, you then need to decrease expenses or increase income. So as I mentioned, again, this is important ratio for lenders, especially when it comes to mortgages, but also it applies to when you're renting as well. So the total debt to income ratio is having to do with all debt. So this can be anything from your mortgage, rent, credit cards, car loans, student loans, and other forms of debt. And so you're taking the total amount of your monthly debt expenses that you're paying, and you're dividing that by your gross income. So in this example, we have a person earning 5,000, but their total debt is at 1,700. So their the ratio is 0.34. So because debt tends to be a lot larger than housing expenses, you can go a little bit higher with this. You can see in this example, they're actually in a pretty safe area. It starts getting dicey when you get to 0.41, 0.45 area. And that's when, again, you'd want to make some changes to either your expenses on the debt side or you want to increase income. And I think we're going to have another module about how to get rid of debt, but that's essentially what this ratio is calculating when it comes to your budget.
We're going to talk about some large budget items. Like we talked about general budgeting. We've talked about specifics of creating a budget and automating, and we've talked about some of those ratios that give us a sense of where we are in the big picture. Now we're going to talk about some very specific large budget items, housing and car purchases. And I want to do car purchases because this is how I paid my way through, one of the ways I paid my way through my undergraduate degree. While I was in the 4 years I was in college, I owned 6 different Toyota 4x4 wagons and probably 8 or 9 different Subaru 4-wheel drive wagons. And I would buy them when they were out of season and sell them when they were in season. And that happened like twice a year. So I did that lots of times over a 4-year period.
Wow.
And I'd buy them for like $400 or $500 and sell them for like, $900 or $1,000. And that literally fed me and kept me in college. Otherwise I wouldn't have been able to do what I did. So, and while I worked full time, so it's good stuff. And this is a list of all the costs, right? This is, they're common when you're buying a vehicle. And you got to consider all these expenses. It's not enough just to buy a car. It's not the list price that's all that matters. You got to think about all of these different little things: registration, documentation, sales tax. Then you got to think about the ongoing costs. The cars that I was buying and selling in college, they were really cheap cars to buy, but man, maintenance on them, if you held them for very long, was really expensive. And gas was usually pretty good on those kinds of things. But again, the maintenance got me. That was the thing. That was the part that I couldn't hold these cars very long because they would fall apart. So it's what a $600 car will get you. So there's a general rule that you should know. And I didn't know this until I started researching for this. It's the 24-10 rule. Has anyone heard that before? The 24-10 rule. So what this rule does is it basically says when you buy a car, you want to put at least 20% down. You want to limit the terms to 4 years, and you want to keep the payment at less than 10% of your income. And you can kind of see how those things work together. Like you want to limit the time of a loan, because interest on that small amount for that much time, the interest gets to be a larger thing. And this is less important today than it was probably when I was doing this, because interest right now is probably 0% or 0.9% on most car purchases. But this is just a way to manage the time, the depreciation cost, everything together when you buy a car. So just really quick, I'm hoping that there's a brave soul here. Can anyone tell us a story about a car purchase that they had that created a surprise expense? And while you're thinking about your story, I'll tell you one of mine. I bought a car, and this is back in those days when I was buying and selling Subarus. I bought a car that was like 8 years old, didn't read the manual, didn't know that, like right about that period of time, about 100,000 miles, 5,000 miles, there was a head gasket. Exactly. Someone had the exact same thing. Look at that. There's a point. That is awesome. There's a point in a Subaru's life where you have to replace the head gasket. And I did not know that. I purchased a car and I had to replace. This is the one car in college that I bought for $800 and had to put in $800 and could only sell it for $1,200 later. So that was a lesson right there. Exactly. That's funny. That's the same story. A lot of stories from buying and selling cars.
Yeah, and I'll just mention, Jonathan, that cars are one of the few assets that you buy that depreciates, right?
Yeah.
It's unfortunate, which is very timely with the conversation we're about to have about leasing and purchasing. So before we get into this, I'm curious if people lease or purchase cars when they do get cars, or if they do get cars. Not myself, I purchase, but I can tell you why. But
I've done both.
yeah,
I
do you have
don't
a
think I'll
preference?
ever lease again, but I've done both.
Do you have a preference?
I buy now.
So when it comes to getting a car, you have the choice, as I mentioned, leasing or purchasing. So when you lease, you're essentially renting a vehicle over a long period of time, and then you have the flexibility of getting a new car every few years. So the benefits are that you may have a lower down payment in monthly payments, but then you don't own the equity of the car and may have to pay for wear and tear. As for purchasing, you are buying the car outright and own it. There's a higher down payment and monthly payments, but you're then allowed to sell the car when you choose to do so, whether that's good or bad, because some people don't want to deal with the hassle.
I'm getting there. There we go.
There you go.
Sorry
So if
about
you
that.
go the route of buying a vehicle, there's some things you want to think about or should be aware of. First, before you buy, you want to know how much you can budget for it. So essentially how much the amount of the purchase is. And then as we kind of mentioned that they depreciate, as soon as you take it off the lot, cars drop in value by 10 to 30%. So that's when they become used, right? So consider a used car, like I think Koala, you mentioned that, and maybe some other people I have, or just be aware if you are purchasing a new car that that's what happens. If you need to finance the purchase, evaluate all of your options and what the terms are. So like now we have lower interest rates, so you're probably gonna get better terms, but in the past, maybe not so much. And then also just plan well in advance so that you're not rushed or pressured into a decision, because when you're there in negotiations, you're gonna feel that pressure from the salesperson. And then Jonathan, you mentioned this already, but you can see there the 2410 guideline that, you know, where did that come from? Like I actually don't know that one, but it's a pretty good one.
That's a good one. Now, when you think about vehicle affordability, it's good to have three pieces of information before you go in and buy. And this is from years of trying to do this, right? That you should have these three pieces of information. You need to know the price that similar buyers have paid for the similar car. You should maybe know the MSRP if it's a new car, and you should know the dealer cost. Now, all of this information is available from different aggregation sites. I think Edmunds has a lot of information like this. And so this actually helps you in the negotiation for a car that you're buying. And you got to understand whether you're leasing or financing, you got to understand your monthly payment. And again, before you buy, what it's going to cost you to insure a vehicle. This is really important. I have a 15-and-a-half-year-old, almost 16, and I have yet, he drives under our insurance until he has his license, and I have yet to price insurance for him, but I'm assuming it's not going to be pretty, because I'm remembering the conversations I had with my parents when I was insured for the first time, and that wasn't pretty either. So you should research, fuel costs and maintenance costs. Those are going to be important. Maintenance, if it's a used car, more. Fuel cost, if you buy, a beast. Didn't get one of those. I know I may have gotten one of those actually. Koala, thank you. Yeah, good grades discount. If you get all this information before you buy, you'll be much better off in the purchase process, and you won't be surprised by future expenses. One of the worst things you can do in the big picture of your personal financial plan is to end up buying something that's really expensive and then surprised by additional costs after the fact. One of the pieces of advice I've always heard, this is something my dad would probably tell me, is if you're buying a Toyota or a Honda or some kind of a very, very reliable, high mileage kind of a vehicle, and you're not buying it new, you're going to probably it's a pretty efficient market out there. You're not going to get, unless you run into that timing belt just before has to get done, or one of those big repairs that you're not expecting, you're probably in pretty good shape for those sorts of things. So that's precisely what we're looking for when we're thinking about a car for Eli. By the way, he's going to buy his own car. I'm not buying his car. Now, you should start buying the car buying experience long before. This is my grandfather and how he would buy something. He would go into the dealer and kind of mosey around and poke at this car, and he'd find the car he wants, and he wouldn't go to that car. He'd go to a different car, and he would say, I'd like to test drive, a different car. And he'd maybe test drive that car, and he'd come back to this car, and he'd leave the dealership, and he'd come back a week later, and he'd look around again, and he'd poke around at some cars. Then he'd look at this car that he really wanted the first time, if it was still there, and say, gosh, and he'd leave again, and he'd come back, and he'd wait till like the end of the month. And at the end of the month, he would have a conversation, and he would make them really come to him with a better price. They would make the first offer, and then he's done all the research. He knows what the dealer's cost is. He knows what the blue book is. He knows all the information, so he knows what the price is he should be paying for this car, and he's always going to try to get it even less than that. My grandfather, the reason I did the trading of cars in college, because he told me that's a good way to make some money in college. So, and he trained me how to do it. So it's definitely a way that you can do the research long before and start communicating long before you end up buying the car itself. That process starts maybe a month before you're going to buy the car, but earlier than that, you kind of know the car price, what the range of car you're looking for, and you're saving for a down payment. You can get better terms the more cash you have for a down payment. So you save up, you have your down payment, you know the car you want, basically the idea of you want, the kind of car, and then you go in and you start this negotiating process. Focused on used, Paul said this, focused on used as much as possible, look for great mileage, shop around for better financing terms, and always negotiate patiently. That's really the key here is the patience.
And I want to share something real quick, Jonathan. I think I mentioned this to you, but I came up with this idea when I was buying my last car, and I knew what car I wanted because I did my research. And then what I did was because now we have internet, I contacted, I think 30 or 40 dealerships in a 60-mile radius and said, here's what I'm looking to get. Tell me your best price. And I played them all against one another, and I ended up getting 20% off the MSRP. So if you want to go through the hassle of that, I did then unsubscribe from a lot of emails, but for me, it was worth it.
Yeah. Well, 20% off MSRP, that's a good deal.
Yeah. So another major expense we're going to discuss is, renting a home. So we'll get into that next. So as we discussed with the housing expense ratio, you shouldn't be spending more than about 31% of your housing expenses of your gross income. So that's what that little thing there at the top is. And that includes all these expenses such as rent, renter's insurance, parking and garage fees, and maintenance or amenities fees. And I've also heard, 28% is another number if that's, you want to be a little bit more conservative, but somewhere in that range. You don't want to really go above that, because then, as unexpected things come up, or life happens like a pandemic or whatever, you don't want to be spending too much on your home, and you want to have it going towards other things in life and savings. So no judgment here. I'm just curious from everybody, how many streaming services do you all have? Feel free to enter the chat. I think I have 4 or 5, and I don't pay for them all. So we'll leave it at that, but I'm just curious. 3? I have the family plan on some of mine, right? Jonathan, do you have streaming services?
Yeah, my wife doesn't let me have Disney Plus. We have 2. We have Netflix and we got Amazon Prime, and that's it. I'm not allowed to add a third.
Yeah, and this will probably increase as time goes on, because I don't know how cable's going to keep up, but we'll see. So other than streaming services, you can see other expenses that come up when it comes to your house expenses or home expenses. It's, we have television, internet, gas and electric, water, and these are things you have to pay, that are fixed, and sometimes they're variable. Like, your gas and electric is going to change every month. So these are things you need to calculate or take into account when you're calculating your home expenses.
So there are a variety of normal, upfront costs when you're renting. First and last month's rent's pretty standard, as is a security deposit. In some places, you're gonna have to set up your own utilities. Some places you may have some moving costs. You want to be really careful at the beginning when you just move into a place, especially if it's your first place, to not begin with a lot of expenses in terms of nesting in the house until if you're just, and this is, I don't know, again, I don't know anyone on the call or everyone on the call. So it's very possible that someone on the call is thinking about coming out of college. And when you come out of college and you're going to move in your first apartment, it's the first time you've had a regular rent due. It's the first time you've had utilities you got to pay. It's the first time you've had, a regular, gas you got to go drive to and from wherever you're going to go work. So it's a really good idea not to start off with a whole bunch of expenses to nest in a house, to get used to rent and all the utilities, all the expenses you're going to have, and then see what your expenses are as you go forward, and then start thinking, okay, maybe some plants and some art on the walls, curtains, those kinds of things. It's because you want to like the place you live. Let's make sure you can afford all the things that go into it before you go and spend a bunch of money. So landlords want two things. Landlords want the rent on time, and they want as few tenant calls as possible. And that includes neighbors calling because tenants are destroying the place or throwing a loud party or whatever. They want to know, so when you're looking to rent a place, they want to know you can afford it, which means not overly in debt, have a good rental history, have paid rent on time before, have left rentals in good condition. They want to know that that you're managing your money well and you're staying out of trouble, generally. And these are good things when it comes to renting an apartment to have and be able to show.
So I know Jonathan mentioned like this is maybe more for people who are less experienced when it comes to finding places, but it might be a good reminder anyway. So once you think you're ready to find a rental, here are some tips you will want to think about. You must know what you can afford, kind of talked about that, and that will kind of expand or limit your choices. And then once you know that, you can look at the different areas that you're interested in living in. And this can be based on proximity to work, lifestyle, or being close to friends or family, or being close to an internet node. Determine how big of an apartment or place you may want and the features you may need, such as, sometimes people don't want to have to deal with laundry. They want a laundry unit inside their unit because they don't have to go to a laundromat. And then once you've narrowed it down, you want to go to open houses and get to know the property and area well. So some good advice I got was like be in the area at nighttime and see what it's like then and how safe it is. And then also just see what's around. And if walking is important to you, then you want to have something that's walkable and so forth. And then you'll get to know the property manager or whoever's, looking for the renter, whether it's the landlord or property manager, and you just want to be polite and submit the application in a timely manner. And then depending on demand, you may even be able to negotiate price for rent.
Maybe.
In the Bay Area, maybe not so much.
Yeah, not so much here.
So before you rent your own place, here are some questions you can ask yourself. Some ones I'm gonna point out are, do I have furniture, bedding, equipment, or moreover, like what will I need to get if I don't? Can I deal appropriately with landlords and agents? If you've never negotiated before or had to deal with paperwork to get approved or you need to get a co-signer, it might be helpful to talk to family or family members, friends, just kind of get advice on how to navigate all these things.
Okay. So there's a lot of literature in the blogosphere discussing renting versus owning. And I'd say that there's good arguments for both. There's a lot of places are really borderline judgmental. You got to buy a house. You got to buy a house. You got to buy a house. And I'd say that if you're not going to, there's a lot of circumstances where you're not going to be someplace for 7, maybe 10 years. It makes no sense to buy a house. All the costs of selling the place would swamp any kind of gains you would have. In the Bay Area, it's a little bit like the stock market or the real estate market. It does actually goes up a lot more than most of the rest of the country. Presumably that means it can come down more than the rest of the country as well. Though we haven't experienced that in our recent past. So again, there's good arguments in both ways. I think that the trigger is if you're in a stable job with a stable income and your intention is to be there for 7 or 10 years, it makes a lot of sense to consider homeownership. There's a lot more that goes into buying a place than a down payment and paying a mortgage. You got to get familiar with the initial cost of the purchase, the ongoing cost of ownership, the cost to sell. And once you know some of these things, you may actually want to rethink. Like my first house in Berkeley, we had a 45-foot cypress crash through my front porch and my neighbor's front porch. They were pointing at each other and destroyed both, and that wasn't fun. And it made me rethink whether I wanted to own a house. We still own a house, so obviously owning the house still won, but it's definitely an issue that you may face at some point. The initial cost of buying a home are basically the down payment. This can be anywhere, depending on your program, 3 to 20% of the price of the house. If you have bad credit or the house is outside your means in terms of the payment, you may have to come up with a larger down payment. There's a lot of folks that use some family money for this, and that's fine as well. So there are costs to securing a loan, including things like appraisal costs and points associated with your rate. and all kinds of little minuscule, tiny little costs to title companies and these sorts of things. You probably have to make an initial mortgage payment when you buy your home, and you'll have to pay some taxes and some insurance up front. So there's costs to move in. It's not always just the mortgage, just the down payment, just your first payment. There's other pieces that have to be thought of as well.
Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about, or I'm going to talk a little about the ongoing expenses. So you had the upfront expenses that Jonathan just mentioned, and then you have some ongoing ones. So you have your monthly mortgage payments and mortgage insurance. And then you have property taxes, which is one people usually don't even consider. And especially here in the Bay Area, because we have high property values, it's a huge expense. And that's paid typically once or twice a year. In other states, it could be higher too because the property tax rate's high, but it's just something sometimes people forget about. You also have homeowners insurance and perhaps other forms of insurance depending on where you live. So here we have in the Bay Area earthquake insurance. I'm from Houston, Texas. We had flood insurance. So there's other expenses you might have that accrue. And then if you're a part of a homeowners association, you may have dues for that. And then lastly, we have maintenance and home improvements that come up. So we'll get more detail about that in a moment.
So is there this is interesting. This whole the question of the homeowners insurance, the fire insurance, flood insurance. So this last year, the house where I live was, I guess they remapped the fire zones, and I wasn't in it. Now I'm in it. So I went to 7 or 8 different companies trying to find insurance. I've lived here for 14, 15 years, and the map got redrawn. Same thing happened to a rental that I have in South Dakota, where it wasn't in the flood zone. Now it's in the flood zone. And so, these things, it's very interesting how these things happen, but, finding the insurance and knowing that that's an issue that you're close to that kind of a zone is probably pretty important.
So having to do with home improvements, here's a list of major ones you can see here. Like a roof, for example, lasts 20 to 30 years, and that's something you need to pay for. And it's, you got to kind of save money for that or have it available to replace. Same goes for flooring. And that can range depending on what kind of flooring you have. And so carpet, you can see 8 to 10 years, linoleum, 25, and it can last as long as 100 years for marble, slate, or granite. And then there's also decks that need repairs if you have them. And then there's other things that aren't mentioned on here, but like exteriors of walls. Like we have shingles in our house, and we have to get those repaired because the sun warps it. Windows, gas heaters, things like that, they need to be replaced or repaired every couple of years.
So to answer it really quick, to answer Koala's question, he asked if there are any taxes being discussed as being waived under the future COVID stimulus bills. I think most of those taxes are state taxes, and the COVID stimulus is coming from the federal government. So I don't think those two things are going to meet. And I don't think the state of California is thinking about waiving anything. So I think you're going to have to pay your property taxes, man.
But you get to deduct $10,000 of it, right? I mean, it used to be 20, but they reduced it.
Yep. Anyway. It used to be unlimited. Now it's limited.
Or unlimited, yeah, right. So here you can see some other ones in the life expectancies of major appliances and structural features that you'll need to replace or repair. Yeah. So you'll need to factor in those expenses in your annual budget when you're a homeowner. So since these expenses occur less frequently, you can budget the amount or for the repair or replacement and divide it by the life of the appliance. So for example, I'm going to use refrigerator and just use a round number for ease of math. But if a new refrigerator costs $1,100 and it lasts 11 years, you should probably budget $100 per year for this future purchase and have it allocated. Because when that dies, you don't want to say, I don't have money to pay for it, and now I can't have a refrigerator. And for larger expenses like a roof, same goes for that, because that can cost $20,000, $30,000 to replace. So you want to make sure that you have money available for these things. And that's when we talk about long-term savings, but also short-term savings.
All right. So when you leave a house, there are always selling costs. And seller pays most of these costs, in California especially, including real estate commission. Now, I've had to pay to fix a bunch of stuff many times before leaving a house. And part of this is just deferred maintenance, and part of it is also you just have to be prepared, because you got to make the house presentable in such a way that people that want to buy a house will want to buy the house, which means sometimes the walls, like we have settling upstairs. We talked about this just the other day. They're settling upstairs, and we have cracks in the kids' walls in their bedrooms. And if we were to sell the house, You know, we'd have to get it painted and to make it presentable, even though the people that come after us will probably paint it a different color. So those expenses are real if you ever want to sell your house. That's actually it. But people have asked questions a little bit through here. We've had some commentary. But I'm happy to stay here and answer other questions about any of this kind of stuff. And then because I thought we'd have a little bit more time, I'm happy to answer other questions as well. So when considering budgeting, any opinions on whether we should pay into the kids' education funds versus into our retirement funds? Oh God, yeah, I'm opinionated on that one. I actually think it's really important to make sure you're funding both, but your retirement should come first. When your kids go to college, they're going to have lots of different sources of income, and you can use some of your retirement funds if you have to. So I think it goes one way and doesn't go the other way. However, Paul is the CFP, and he's going to correct me. Go ahead.
No. I'm in agreement with you, but I will say it's a values-based question, because
Yes, fair
if
enough.
you value your children, like you want to really give to your children before yourself, we want to, acknowledge that.
Yeah.
But all things in a vacuum, you're right. I think retirement first, because you don't want your kids paying for your retirement, right? So.
Right. There's a story that one of my coaches, actually Scott's coaches as well, said a long time ago, and he said that there's something that every 70-year-old understands that a few 60-year-olds get, and if you're 40 or 50, you've got no idea about, and that is if you were given the choice when you're, after you spent your last dollar, to either be dead or go across town and ask your kids for money, most 70-plus-year-olds are going to choose to die before they go ask their kids for money. That's why real important to fund your retirement and help them as much as you can. Real important to fund your retirement. You will not want to ask your kids for support later on.
And they'll have a lot more years to live to earn income than you will, right? So.
Right. True.
Going back to at the beginning of it, you were talking about Mint and other apps that can help with budgeting. And so I'm wondering, because what we were doing was, pulling our bank statements, and then there's a function that allows you to sort of budget into general categories, and you end up having to fix everything there. And then we're using an Excel spreadsheet over here, and it's really time consuming and not efficient. And I'm wondering what the pros and cons are of the sort of top two or three apps out there.
I can speak to that if you want me to, Jonathan. Or
Please go ahead.
the two top ones I know of are Mint, and then You Need a Budget, or YNAB. And YNAB is one that's not free. You have to pay. I think it's like, I actually don't know the cost, to be honest. But the nice thing about YNAB is that it's different than Mint, is it doesn't just track, it helps change your behaviors. So kind of like as you're entering in information and saying what things are, it fills in different buckets, and it kind of helps you shape I haven't done it before, but I've heard from other people that it helps shape your behavior and helps you like be more mindful about how you're spending your money. Whereas in Mint, it's just purely tracking, and you're just labeling. And sometimes it has issues where like you'll track it and then it'll change it if you have certain categories, which I found to be flawed. So I made up my own categories and do my own customized ones when I use Mint. So I don't pay for YNAB because I just do it myself. But if you wanted more help with your actual budgeting behavior, I would say YNAB's a good resource to use. And then there's the third one I would say is Personal Capital, but it's not really made for budgeting. That's another data aggregator.
I think we could all have dinner now. Thanks, everyone.